Good morning.
How are you?
I'm good and yourself.
I'm doing good. I'm doing good. Thank you so much for taking part and taking time out of your day to be a part of this interview.
No problem whatsoever.
This whole series is the Black History Month series where we interview Black UMass alumni or UMass students and just talk about their experience in their life. So, tell me a bit about yourself.
I'm originally from Long Island, New York. I grew up in Long Island. I was born in Brooklyn, New York, grew up in Long Island, New York. When I was younger, jazz was the thing that my father would play that I'd be like, can we not listen to this, please? Like, I don't like this thing. I started playing trumpet when I was about 12 years old. And my brother, one of my older brothers, was going to a program called the Jazzmobile in Harlem. So the Jazzmobile was started by a very famous pianist, Dr. Billy Taylor, many, many, many decades ago. And what the Jazzmobile program was that you would come there on a Saturday, you'd be in a group class with your instrument, then you take a music theory class and you can audition for an ensemble. If you place in an ensemble, get in the ensemble. So I started going there with my brother because I was practicing this trumpet and my brother was like, you should just come with me and just like learn music.
Mm.
Little did I know that that interaction was going to change my life because the people that were the faculty at Jazzmobile, almost every single one of them were people that we would now call jazz legends. Now, at the time, I didn't know that,
How
and
could
so
you?
when I started getting into, it's like I started when I started getting into jazz for myself, what wound up happening is that like I was like, wait, I'll go out to store, I would buy records, and I'm like, wait, isn't that person that I see on Saturday? And I would bring the records in, but like, hey, is this you? Like, and they'd be like, yeah. I'm like, okay, I'll go buy another record. Is that you too? Wait, you're famous. And they would all laugh. They'd get a really great laugh out of it. And so that was the thing, like that really changed my world. But even before that, I had always heard jazz because on Sunday mornings in New York, where I grew up at, my mom would play a gospel radio program on WBLS. And the announcer on WBLS, every time there was an intermission, in the background was a recording of Miles Davis playing Someday My Prince Will Come. So I would hear this thing every Sunday. My mom would listen to it, and it sounded great. I just thought it was like at the time, I just thought it was something that he had made for him, like to play, like when he was talking. But I heard it, and I would see it, and I would listen to this thing every Sunday. And after a while, like I just really liked hearing it, and
Wow.
it kind of led me in a direction that made me, want to pursue jazz. In middle school, I started playing in the jazz band, and in high school, I played in the jazz band. And where I grew up at for my last 2 years of high school, I actually went to two separate high schools at the same time. I went to one in the morning for music, and I went to one in the afternoon for my academics. And it just, yeah, it's taken me it's taken me all through, bringing me to New England and where I am right now.
Wow. So, who would you say influenced you to actually pick up the trumpet? Because there's so many other instruments you could have chosen.
Well, and I played several instruments. The first instrument I played was a violin, didn't like that. Then I tried a trombone, didn't like that. Then I was trying percussion, loved percussion. And I had a teacher who, when I was finishing fifth grade, who says to me, who tricked me actually, Laura Sanchez, she said to me, I need more trumpet players. I'm like, no, I want to keep percussion playing drum set. And she was like, you know, you mastered percussion in a half a year. You're the best percussionist in school in a half a year. I really need more trumpet players. You can do both. This thing has three keys. How hard can it be? And I'm like, you know what? Sure, I'll do that. And so she gives me one at the end of the year, and I'm trying to produce a sound, and I'm like, man, this thing's broken. And she's like, oh, okay, just take this other one. And I took it and I went home and I realized she tricked me. She really tricked me. I was like, you know what? I'm gonna show her. I'm gonna come back. I'm gonna be able to play this thing. I came back to school be able to play the trumpet, for as best as I could. And I started taking lessons from her in school, and I realized she tricked me twice. Like she knew I was going to do this. She knew this was going to be my response. Yeah, I mean, I get a great laugh every time I tell that story because I didn't want to play trumpet. I like it wasn't what I wanted. Like I wanted to play saxophone, but there was too many saxophones. And then I wanted to play drums, but she said she needed a trumpet, and like that's how I got started.
Band directors know how to trick us into doing things, but it's for, look at you, it's for the betterment.
Yeah, I mean, I don't regret it. That's for sure.
What do you think makes the trumpet such an iconic instrument in jazz?
Well, I mean, the trumpet has, it's a melody instrument, but when you start talking about what jazz is and the history of jazz, I have a definition of jazz that I teach to my students. I say jazz is a collection of cultures and traditions together. The byproduct of that is music. Therefore, jazz is not music, it's culture. And in order to understand the music, you have to understand the culture that created it.
Mm,
And when you think about that kind of a definition for jazz, you have to start by going back to looking at certain West and Central African drumming and singing traditions, because the enslaved Africans that were brought to this country, that were the pioneers of all of American music for that matter. It started there. And then you have to look at, well, what happened when they got here? And when you look at what happened when they got here and how that mixed together with other cultures that they were around, how that mixed together with aspects of European culture, you start to realize that like this music, it's not only America's greatest export, but it's something that happened because of struggle, because of all this negativity. Something beautiful came out of it. I've been to several places around the world, and I've heard jazz musicians from all different countries and playing in different countries. And I'm this is 2021, right when quarantine was starting to get lifted. I was on tour with a band in Austria, and we were playing at this festival there. And in order to comply with the regulations around COVID at that time, they had to have all the bands that were going to play on the stage at once. You couldn't move. So the promoter had one band would play a couple of songs, then the next band would play a couple of songs, the next band would play a couple of songs, and then would go back that way. So what happened is, we're listening to these bands from, all over Europe on the stage, and they all, they sound pretty good. But then when the American band is playing, it's like people, like the lighting people left the lighting boards, the sound people left. You see iPhones and phones in all of our faces. This is like a 13-piece band, and you see all these phones and faces and filming because the way we play that we have is unlike where else in the world because of what we had to go through to get this to be what it is. And
mm,
it's not that no one else has had to go through anything, but when you have to go through something in order to get to a place, like you're going to have a level of authenticity about it that nobody else who didn't have to go through what you had to go through, what your culture had to go through, is going to ever be able to mimic that sound. And what you find when you travel is Americans who play jazz, whether you're famous or not, but you are loved everywhere. Well, except here, but you're loved everywhere else. You go to Europe, you're loved. You go to Japan, you're loved. They love jazz. And so like when I think about jazz from that perspective, I also think about the people that taught me, the legends that taught me, why I came to Hartford to study with the legendary alto saxophonist Jackie McLean. And a lot of what they taught me is that you learn what we teach you and what we went through, and then you have your own experiences, and you have a responsibility now to get back.
mm,
However way that shapes out, that's part of how you preserve the culture. Because now jazz is academic. It's learned mostly in colleges and in music programs, after school programs, extracurricular programs. But jazz academia is not that old. I mean, the first jazz program was like what, 1972? It's still not that old. And most people, the way they learned jazz prior to that was they learned it by apprenticing. So if you look at some of the earliest known jazz in New Orleans, there wasn't jazz school. There was school to learn how to play an instrument. There was school to learn how to play European music. But jazz school was you were in someone's band and they would teach you that.
mhm, mhm,
The learning was on the bandstand. It wasn't in a classroom. And I think a lot of people forget European music and the institution of Western European classical music is hundreds of years old, not just in terms of the music itself, but in the education of it. But jazz is an American creation that was created at the end of the 1800s and started flourishing in the early 1900s.
Hmm.
And its life in academia as we know it, at least here in this country, it's not that old. If you look at the cultures that where this came from, a lot of these West African cultures and Central African cultures that were forcibly brought to this country, it was all tradition. So, New Orleans, you can still find griots. Well, griots date back to Africa. They're not an American invention. Griots were storytellers who kept the oral history of a village. And so in jazz, we had that in terms of how we learn the music, the significance of certain historical events that have happened. So like there's a sense about when you put any form of art, not just jazz, but we'll deal specifically with jazz because that's what this interview is about. But the moment you put jazz in an institution and you start creating advanced degrees, what tends to happen is academia says the people that are qualified to teach this music now are the people that have these advanced degrees. Now, some of these people with degrees may have never been on the road, never been in a real bandstand, never touched someone who was a creator of this music or creator of any of the different substyles of this music, never really had in contact with that authenticity, but they've had contact with academia. So there's certain things that academia has done for jazz that is wonderful, like absolutely phenomenal. I have 2 degrees in different areas of jazz. I wouldn't have gotten them if they weren't valuable to get. But there's other things that sometimes get lost when you have not been in touch with the people who were the progenitors, the creators, and the people that took it on and pushed it further in their time. Like there's a missing thing that sometimes happens. And it's one of the reasons why I chose to get into academia in the first place, is to be able to take that thing that I was given and that I continue to experience and make sure today get that, because they need that just as much as they need all the academic things we have to teach.
Having earned a bachelor's degree in African American music studies, how would you describe diving into the history of Black music and the influence it had on the way you approach your art? We've talked about this a little bit, but if you want to delve a little deeper.
I think, I make I make a statement. So, when I teach jazz history, well, I'll be actually teaching jazz history for the first time at UMass this coming semester. But when I teach a jazz history class, other colleges that I've worked at, um, I start off the class the very same way. No matter what college I teach it at, the first day we go over the syllabus, we do all that normal stuff, and then I have a question, and I say to everyone in class, anyone that can prove me wrong, your reward is you get an A on everything. You never have to show up to class again. And I pay you $100. And the question is, find me one form of American created music, not Native American music, American created music, in the States of America, not imported from Europe, created here in what we know as the USA, that you cannot trace back to enslaved Africans and their descendants. If you can find me one, that's your price. It's a trick question. You can't find one. Not
What are the
one.
most popular answers, though, that students like to give?
Metal. Okay, I'll trace that back. Death metal can trace that back. House music, that's easy. Rock and roll, that's easy too. Like, because people don't know, they don't know, they don't understand, they don't see how the legacy is. And what I say to people is, by calling it Black music, what we're saying is that this is the culture of origin. It doesn't mean that it's only open for Black people. It doesn't mean that Black people are the only that innovated. It's the culture of origin, period. That's what we're saying. And this fact of American music and culture has been ignored for centuries. So when we about Black music, I grew up in what's commonly called the golden era of hip hop. I grew up, late 80s, early 90s. I mean, well, not late 80s. I grew up in the 80s and the 90s. I mean, hip hop is only maybe 3 years older than me, 3 or 4 years. So it's like I grew up during a time in which what we call that golden era, when we had so many different varieties of hip hop before hip hop became mostly controlled by the record industry. You had so many vantage points and viewpoints. But then I also had R&B, not just the R&B that I grew up on, but you go in my mother's house, you would hear Earth, Wind and Fire records, you'd hear Luther Vandross, Teddy Pendergrass. I grew up with my mom's R&B. I grew up with my older siblings. Their generation grew up with my generation of R&B. My mom would listen to that gospel station on Sundays. I would hear that. I would hear jazz. You know, And so I heard all of these different forms of Black music growing up. And what I realized growing up as an adult and learning more about it is that no matter which style you talk about, all of these styles have the same thing in common. They were birthed from a set of experiences. They were birthed from a set of circumstances that isn't common in all forms of music. And because of that, it's influenced the music that I play heavily. I have music that I've written that ranges from everything from, yeah, I'm tired of watching all these Black men get killed by police when they haven't done anything wrong, to a friend of mine, unfortunately felt that she had no recourse and committed suicide. And I've written about that. I've written about Bible verses that are important to me. And I've just written music that just sounds good and that didn't have any other purpose, but it just sounds good in my head. So I want to write it out and play it. So like the music that I write and the music that I play is very much informed by the life that I live. And that's really the soundtrack of what Black music is. It's about the life that we live. You think about any point in American history, you think about the civil rights movement, anyone that was alive and on the picket lines in the civil rights movement, I bet you they can name 10 songs that they heard all the time. You think about World War One. What did we hear a lot in World War One? Well, we heard traditional big band music. We heard all that dance band music. What did we hear during the Vietnam War? Well, we heard a combination of things. We heard responses from R&B, from folk music, from folk rock music, from rock and roll. So like history, Black music is the soundtrack of this country. And if you really look at the history of this country, you can trace the history of this country and like in so many ways, shapes, and form to the evolution of Black music in this country. So it literally informs like everything that I as a musician, just limited to jazz. Every form of Black music I've been exposed to, all informs what I do. Matter of fact, there's a popular song in the 80s called All This Love by El DeBarge. One of my favorite songs, like ever in. And one day I decided, I want to play this. I was playing a jazz festival. I want to play this. So I listened to it and I wrote it out for my band. And when I played it, I said to the audience, who knows what that song is? And most everybody yelled because they knew the song. So I was like, I don't limit myself to just the jazz standards that I grew up listening to. Anything that I like. If I like it and I want to play it, I'm going to play it. And it's going to inform what I do and how I do.
You have founded the Neef Jazz Entertainment, which is such a great platform for promoting jazz. What was your vision when creating this space?
Well, I actually created it as a way to make sure that I don't get too much taxes from the IRS for an event that I manage, actually. That was its origin. So I manage a weekly jam session in Hartford at a restaurant called Black Eyed Sally's. And that jam session is sponsored by the Hartford Jazz Society. And so, they send me the money and I administrate the series. And the original purpose in starting it was to have a company that can hold that money, bear, and then me not look like I made more money than I actually did. But over time, it's kind of evolved because, I've met more people. I have regular clients now, and it's a platform for not only to advocate more about jazz, but it's a platform to help other musicians be employed. Like the number one thing when you think about a gig worker, when we talk about gig workers, I mean, up in 10 years ago, that meant musicians. But now you talk about gig workers who Uber, DoorDash, Lyft, all these other like gig services. The gig worker's wage hasn't really risen much since the 70s. And so with the platform that I have, it's okay, let's promote this music. Let's promote how great it is. Let's promote why we should, be paying attention to this. But let's also make sure people are working. Let's make sure that people are working and getting like a decent wage for what they're being asked to do. Let's make sure that people are aware that this music is so important and it's not just background music. This past summer, my company was very fortunate enough to be able to partner with another company, and we presented, a series of 16 outdoor concerts in West Hartford, Connecticut, and then we did another 4 in South Windsor, Connecticut. So, like, it's been growing, and it's been changing and it's been evolving over time, just like we do as human beings. I mean, I think anyone that thinks that what they wanted when they were six, that they're going to want all those same things when they're 26, no, not really. We're growing, we're changing, and so is that company.
Jazz is often called America's classical music, but it's also the story of Black resilience and creativity. How do you carry that legacy into your performances and compositions?
I look at it as like I look at it in three different ways. One, responsibility, because of the people who came before me taught me how much of a responsibility it is. Two, it's an honor because I get carry on something from my predecessors that they taught me, and they said, okay, but when you're kiss on, also be you. Find where you are in the midst of this. So it's an honor. And the third thing is it's a gift. Not everyone can play music, but to know that your music can put a smile on someone's face, can make someone happy, can help someone when they're feeling a certain way. And like to know that when you write something meaningful and you explain to people that, you wrote something that was inspired by something else and people relate to that, like that's a gift. It's a gift that I am honored to be able to share with people. And it's something I don't take for granted because, like any other gift, it could go away at any time, but it's something it's an honor, it's a responsibility, and it's a gift all at once. And this legacy of Black music, once again, it's the legacy of American culture. It's the legacy of the story of America. And now, more than ever, we need outlets within the arts that allow us to tell real, factual stories.
Jazz is about also dialogue between instruments. How do you use your instrument, your trumpet, to engage in that conversation?
Well, I tell my students that, when you're playing jazz, you're having a dialogue with three different audiences. Four, if you really want to be technical. The first dialogue is the one you have with yourself. Why would I say that? Because we human beings, especially we jazz musicians, we have this habit when we're playing a song, we're improvising. And when we're improvising, if something doesn't go right, sometimes we have this going of having an argument self. Why did I do that? Man, I suck. Man, this is good. So like you have first, it's the conversation you have to have with yourself to remind yourself, okay, you made a mistake. So what? Bookmark it so that you can fix it when you're practicing again. But just keep playing. That's the first conversation. Second conversation is with the playing. Because what we're all supposed to be doing when we're playing music together is we're supposed to be listening. Because sometimes when someone does something, someone may want to respond to it. And if you're so focused on your one individual thing, dialogue with the band. Third dialogue is the dialogue with the audience. That conversation with the audience is sometimes, it's about you're playing for them and they're listening, they're receiving, and sometimes they're going to cheer for you. Sometimes they're going to respond a certain way, and that there's that dialogue. But the fourth dialogue is also with the reactions, because sometimes somebody, and it's not even just the audience, it could be someone in your band that's like, yeah, or hey, or ooh. And now you're having another conversation with that reaction. You're either going to repeat what got the reaction, or you're going to keep going because it's going to propel you to a place that you weren't even thinking about. So, like, those are the dialogues that you're having, the conversations you're having when you're playing jazz, regardless of the instrument you're playing. When you realize that this is what you have and this is what's going on and this is what you're doing, you're like, wow, this is much more than I thought it was.
Mm.
And there's so much more to this than I could have possibly imagined. And I think that's one of the things that propels me forward to continue to do this is because the dialogue is always different. You can play the same song for 5 straight nights and it'll never be the same. Things will never be the same. You may try to repeat that thing you did the night before that got a reaction and it may get no reaction. So it's how do you maintain authenticity? Because when you're fishing for a reaction, you're fishing for applause, that's usually when you're playing worse
Mm.
because you're fishing for something. And when you don't get it, you're getting negative reinforcement of just being you and just finding the positive in whatever you're doing.
Have you mentored young musicians, and what advice do you give them about navigating the world of jazz?
Yeah, I mean, I mentor a lot of young musicians where I live, but I'm also on faculty at two different colleges. And so I'm constantly not just teaching musicians, but I have younger musicians that are not in any of my classes at the colleges I work at that I mentor as well. And I constantly tell them, like, this is about life. You know, this past semester, one of my students at UMass came into his lesson very stressed. And, he wasn't able to he wasn't really able to play as well as he could. And I said, and I said to him, stop, put the horn away. And we talked, and I said, here's your homework assignment. I said, and I'm very serious. And if you don't do this, you will get a failing grade for this assignment. He's like, okay, what's my assignment? Like, go out. It's on Saturday. Go to a movie. You like burgers? Go have a burger. Go play some pool with your friends. Play some video games. Do something, but go live life. Stop being so stressed. That's one of the number one things I tell musicians that I mentor, that this is about life. And if you're not living life, you don't really have much to say anyway. And life isn't always going to be happy. It's always going to be sad. It's going to be life. And you have to live life in order to have anything authentic to say out of your music. No matter how much you learn, no matter how many solos you can repeat verbatim, no matter how much you learn, you can insert here, no matter how many spontaneous ideas you have, if it's not filtered through your life, what do you have? Like, you know, jazz is life, but life is not necessarily jazz. Life is what you live. Jazz is a way of expressing it, but jazz isn't the totality of your life.
If you could collaborate with any artist, past or present, who would it be and why?
You know, I've been thinking about this question for a while because a lot of the people wanting to collab I have, but there's one person that comes to mind, and I tell him this all the time. Um, he's no longer alive, but the great bassist Ray Brown. When I listen to any record that Ray Brown is playing bass for, like his bass stands out in way other bassists has ever stood out for me. And I was joking with my students last semester. I said, "Let me tell you how much I love Ray Brown." We were listening to a record that Ray Brown was on, and I'm like, "Oh, that's Ray Brown right there." And they're like, "How do you know?" Like his sound. I know that sound. I know this record. And I said, "I'm going to tell you how much I love Ray Brown." I said, "If Ray Brown was alive and called right now, and I saw his name on the caller ID, this lesson may have to stop. And if he said, I need you to be in California tomorrow, there's a plane ticket. I'm like, I will see you next. I will see you next week because I gotta go be with Ray Brown. It's something about his sound, how he cultivated, the music, the history in his sound, the history in what he did, his attention for bringing in young musicians as a bass player. He would always bring in young pianists and young drummers to round out his trio, and his nurturing of teaching them on the bandstand, his way of showing people how to live this music and play this music. That's the one person that, like, if I could have, I would definitely wanted to collaborate with. One of my favorite albums of his, and yes, I am biased as a trumpet player, is he did an album in the 90s called, he did a series of albums called Some of My Best Friends Are. And these albums, he did one with soloist, one with vocalist, one with trumpet players. And he would have five, individuals record two songs each. So one of my favorite album, of course, is the one with the trumpet players. Some of my best friends are the trumpet players. And there's a record on that called "I Thought About You" with this trumpet player from Australia named James Morrison. And the record starts where they're playing the melody by them. It's just Ray Brown on bass and James Morrison on trumpet. And it isn't until James Morrison starts to improvise that the rest of the band comes in. But his playing there is just phenomenal.
What legacy do you hope to leave in the world of jazz?
That's an interesting question because I was just talking to one of my brothers earlier this morning, and I was telling him, I remember making a statement a long time ago, and every time, every time I get mad about certain things, this event flashes back into my head, and it's actually a statement that I made when I was teaching a lesson in a church about 20 years ago. And I said, you know, I would rather be known by a small amount of people and a whole world than be known by the whole and only affect a small amount of people. What I mean by that statement is I could care less whether anyone knows what I've done. What I care about, the people that I've been able to mentor, teach, talk to. Do you really understand what this is? Do you really understand what jazz is? Do you really understand why it's important? And and I look back on my musical career and say that, hey, no matter how well or how badly I played, I was able to be my authentic self. That's the legacy that I want to leave. An example says, yeah, this is a way to do this, and this is a way that works. To me, that's what legacy is. Legacy isn't, we always are going to have, no matter what we talk about, jazz, history, sports, it's going to be the legacy of the most well-known people who have accomplished all these great things. But for me, it's, I could, where I live, did I fulfill the reason why I'm here on this earth to begin with? And this is part of that reason. I want to be able at the end of my life to say, yeah. And I want the people that knew me to be able to say, yeah, he did. That's the legacy I want to leave in jazz.
Wow. Very powerful and impactful. Well, that's all the questions we had for you today. Is there anything else you would like to add?
You know, I find this hard because, I did my master's degree at UMass much later in life than most people do. And, now I'm going into my fourth semester teaching at my alma mater. And to be not just a student who's been here and studied here, I mean, the African American, the African American Music Study Department at UMass is phenomenal. This is a very special place. It's a very special faculty with a very rich legacy as in excellence in African American music. So I'm honored to be doing this interview. I'm honored, and I'm honored to now be a part of the legacy of teaching people what this is at my alma mater.